Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event on the role of science and innovation in sustainable growth. We're very happy to be hosting this theme here, which is a very important theme. We are really struggling to ensure that we deal with climate change challenges, but also the associated competitiveness and the associated strategic autonomy issues here. These are very important. What is also important is that, of course, we need to be able to deploy whatever we already have in terms of science and technology and innovation, but that we also need these new science and technology and innovation solutions here in order to be able to deal with this effectively here. It's also obvious that we cannot just rely on the science and technology and innovation machine just to be delivering whatever we want here. We need to be able to steer this as well. So policy will be very important here. And that means we really need to know very well in terms of where we are for science, technology and innovation. Are we developing the right kind of solutions here, but also evidence on the policy interventions, the framework conditions that allow for science and technology to really play its powerful role here. So that's really what the challenge is that we're facing here, and for which we're very happy to be able to present here more recent evidence that the OECD has been collecting on its report on where we are in terms of indicators on measuring science, technology and innovation, and then discussing first of all, what does this tell us in terms of the picture, but also where we need to go in terms of the longer term, for what kind of indicators would we be also be needing for policy. We have a splendid panel for that. So first of all, we will have Jerry Sheehan, the director of the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation, who can be more adept than here for the OECD, who will be presenting their latest report on this. And after that, we will open up the panel for a discussion of where we are, where we should be, where we will have Julia Reynaud joining us here. She's Senior Director at Breakthrough Energy, so she really also knows very well where we should be, where we are here, and to drive the discussion for for the future as well here. And then, of course, we also rely on you for questions and answers, and also on the audience that joins us through Slido here. So please, please also make sure that you submit your questions here, on which we will be able to draw. So I think it's high time we actually leave the floor now to Jerry to present us the latest on where we are in terms of indicators on science, technology and innovation for sustainable growth. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to take the floor and I'm going to move it over here.
Yep.
If we can. And let me just first thank you for the introduction. Great pleasure for me to be here on behalf of the OECD to share with you some key findings from, it's not just our newest report, it's the report we are launching today on measuring science and innovation for sustainable growth. So you are part of the launch and the first to really see public demonstration of some of the facts and figures that we've compiled in this very important report. Also, before I begin, let me just take the opportunity to thank some of our other contributors here and colleagues in doing this. This includes the European Commission, as well as Breakthrough Energy, who've helped support some of the key work streams that I'll be reporting on today that have contributed very much to the report. That includes, on a couple of projects you'll hear me make reference to as I go through some of the key findings of the report, and I move the microphone closer to my mouth for you all, something called our MABIS report, which is for measuring and assessing government support for innovation, and something called the Bridge. I think we at OECD are almost as good as the Commission in coming up with good acronyms for our programs and projects. That is building a robust, innovative entrepreneurship ecosystem for a digital and green economy, also known as the Bridge Project. And also Breakthrough had helped us in supporting some of the work that we've done looking at COVID-19 recovery packages, and also work that supported us in related to the green transition, which is what the focus will be today. I think the focus of everything that I'm going to share with you today is about the role that STI, science, technology, and innovation have to boost economic well-being while addressing the major global environmental challenges that we face as a global community. And I think that if we want to be able to harness and direct the power of STI effectively, policymakers do require fit-for-purpose measurement. So we'll come back to the measurement agenda that Reinhild had already mentioned, that can capture the complexity, the multifaceted contributions of science and technology and innovation to the green transition and the role played by many different actors in the innovation process and the impact of a variety of different policies. So with that, let me move on and tell you a little bit about the publication. So this publication aims to provide a new and comprehensive set of evidence on the role of science and innovation helping deliver progress on environmental sustainability. I will say my colleagues, including Petra Kelly, who's sitting here in the audience, Fernando Galindo Rueda, back at the OECD, have literally left no stone unturned in trying to find interesting and novel indicators that can shed light on this important issue. Some of these old and some of these new. If you have a copy of the report, we brought a few of them up, and I think there's one left that a lucky recipient in the audience can take home with them later today, and I'll also show you how to get an electronic copy. You'll see that we have 144 indicators in the report, all related to science, technology, and innovation around green, environment, and energy issues. And we see this as serving as something of a reference document for policymakers, it's for statisticians, certainly the research community, and the wider public who are looking for answers and some guidance about how science and tech can contribute in a full way to sustainable growth objectives. And it aims to cover, I'll say full, at least most of the science, technology, innovation chain, from research through development and implementation. We'll see even some of the implications that science, technology, and innovation have had in helping make the green transition a little bit easier. I should also say that this work was coordinated by OECD's Working Party of National Experts on Science and Technology Indicators. The chair, which is sitting to my left here, the NESTI group. It draws on inputs from across the OECD as well as from our sister agency, the International Energy Agency, and again, many other organizations, including the European Commission. Uniquely, I think the report also reflects critically on the indicators it puts forward, assessing the degree to measure what we say they measure and what they should measure. And these reflections, in fact, then lay the groundwork for a measurement agenda toward the end of the report that can enable a more effective, more nuanced, more robust assessment of how science, tech, and innovation contribute to sustainable development. So I'm not going to walk through all 144 of the measures for you in the time I have, but I do want to highlight on the 7 key messages that are highlighted in the report, and what I'll try to do is give you at least one piece of evidence from the report to illustrate it. So recognize that that's just a small selection of everything you'll find in the report, and I would encourage you to download and otherwise look at the number of indicators that we have. So let me start off on something of a positive note, and this comes kind of the end cycle, if you will. And the first message is that from what we can see, innovation is transforming in the marketplace faster than was previously thought possible, as many technologies, new, cleaner, greener technologies, have actually become more competitive and cost competitive to be deployed in our industries and across our societies. So the cost reductions, largely powered by technological innovation, have helped accelerate the adoption and uptake of these new technologies across key sectors. So you can see here in 2023, for instance, electricity from large-scale solar photovoltaics was 56% cheaper than that from fossil fuels, and that's a big change from 2010 when it was actually 4 times more expensive. So a huge progress there. I think on the slide we only show the renewable energy technologies, but just note that big strides have also been made in mobility. And as the report cites, according to our colleagues at the IEA, the global electric car fleet numbered 58 million at the end of 2024, and that was more than triple its size in 2021, just 3 years earlier. So we are making progress in making these technologies more competitive. I think the second key message I want to share is about the critical role of science and technology in this process. And from our indicators, we found that science underpins energy and environmental innovation through critical and often underappreciated channels. I'll say multiple different channels. And basic science and scientific collaboration are key. So I think as many of you will appreciate, science is an essential precursor to many of the key technologies that help us abate pollution and address greenhouse gases. Also, we use science to help us better understand the state of the environment and the impact of environmental change. It also produces the knowledge that can help drive changes in individual behaviors as well as help influence the course of policy that'll have a broader impact. Finding, however, the so-called green footprint in scientific articles is not a trivial endeavor, and I think our team has made great progress in trying to do that and trying to track the knowledge flows that can be somewhat unpredictable. For instance, we know that advances in solid-state physics and semiconductor research in the mid-20th centuries paved the way, right, for the discovery of the photovoltaic effect in silicon, which underlies today's solar photovoltaic industry. So how do we trace that path back? The report includes a range of indicators that demonstrate the many, many different ways in which science contributes to environmental sustainability. For example, climate change and mitigation adaptation patent filings that build more directly on scientific knowledge than we see from high carbon technologies. In fact, they cite nearly 6 times as many peer-reviewed articles in those patents in climate change and mitigation filings than you'd see in high carbon ones. Here on the slide, you can see some of the cited disciplines in these areas, including energy, chemistry, material science, computer science as well, that also play a role in low carbon technologies, much more so than in high carbon so-called patents. The third message I'll share with you, the third message is that the world is changing, as it often does, right? And in this case, OECD countries are now facing increasing competition when it comes to science and innovation and addressing energy and environmental goals. So what you can see on the slide here is that the share of scientific publications relevant to energy and environmental goals published from those in OECD countries, the share has declined remarkably since 2008. The contribution of the EU has declined, for example, while that of China and India have increased significantly on the bottom slide. This is actually a reflection both of the growing efforts around energy and environment in countries like China and India, and also, as we've seen, almost a flatlining of the number of publications that are being produced on these topics among OECD countries. And, I mean, on the same point, we can look at patent indicators because we also see the same growing competition, if you will, here. This chart shows the share of environmentally related patent filings that are under the Patent Cooperation Treaty. These are PCT filings. You can see, again, in the many bars on the chart, that the share of environmental related patent filings has increased substantially in some countries, 3 countries in particular, like Denmark, Latvia, smaller countries, and China. What you don't see on the chart is that in China, for example, so-called high-quality patent filings in environmental technologies grew more than 6-fold between 2010 and 2020, while that of those patent filings from the US and the EU grew by less than 20%. So there's a big change there. The fourth message, right, so how do we get to these scientific publications? How do we generate new patents and new knowledge? It's often through research and development. And what you can see here is going back to 1981 is that the public support of R&D for energy and environmental innovation has been sluggish now for decades. It's picked up recently, but between 1980 and 2006, government budgets for R&D dedicated to the energy and the environment remained largely flat. In fact, they declined from their 1981 levels. We've seen an uptick recently, so that by the end of 2023, they stood at 7% of total R&D, some uptick, but as I mentioned, for some reason the publication levels are remaining flat across the OECD at the same time. So next message, as we look for policymakers, we know that many of them are in the room with us, and the question is always, what policies can work to help us move the needle in these areas. And the fifth message that comes out of our report is that it does matter how you support R&D. What we find is that more directed R&D supports appear to be more effective in supporting environmental-related innovation than more neutral instruments, i.e. things like tax incentives. So this is a result that comes from some important EU-funded work under our so-called MicroBird project that shows that direct public funding for business R&D is positively associated with the uptake of innovations and with environmental benefits. R&D tax incentives, by contrast, show a much smaller, if any, clear effect in the EU countries. We can also examine some of the associations between these different policy instruments and other outcomes, such as energy and environment-related R&D expenditure by businesses, but also patents, which have been classified into whether they are green, gray, or high carbon. And by and large, what we find is the same pattern holds. In those countries where we see more directed support for R&D, we also see more positive outcomes, green outcomes in terms of patenting behavior. This is based on a little bit of what we consider a green pilot run of some data. However, it does seem, as we've gone through additional analyses, that these findings will hold more broadly. Let me close with one, again, maybe positive note here. We've looked at public opinion, and it does appear that public opinion supports the notion and appreciates the notion that science and innovation are important contributors to the green transition. So by this, what we mean is the 2024 edition of the Eurobarometer survey focused on issues around environment, asked respondents their views on the four most effective ways of tackling environmental challenges. Investing in R&D, actually to find technical solutions, received very high endorsement. Almost half the respondents from the EU, on average, classified it among the most effective measures. In countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, the scores were above 60% and above. So finally, and this is the seventh key message that I'll relay to you from the report, we want to make the case that a focused, concerted action is needed to generate this kind of evidence on science and innovation and demonstrate its contribution to environmental goals and better inform policy. We do find major evidence gaps that hinder decision-making at the intersection of science and innovation and sustainable growth, and governments can respond by adapting a more ambitious measurement agenda that's laid out in the report for you. So again, we know we can manage what we measure, and we need a measurement agenda that will help us on this relationship between science, technology, innovation, and environmental performance. So let me thank you again for the time to present these fresh results with you. You can find the report as shown on the slide. My colleague Petra is here, who will be happy to answer detailed questions about how we generated some of these details. And as I said, we have the chair of the Nesti group here as well. I want to thank our organizers for giving me the opportunity to share this with you today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry. You illustrated very nicely the power of having really high-quality data and evidence to guide our discussion and our actions here. So thanks a lot for this presentation. There is definitely way more in the report, but you did a very nice selection here. I have to say, I'm going to take my position as a chair here to claim the last copy of this. Thank you.
Just the thickness of the report will demonstrate
yeah.
how much is there.
Yep. I'm sure I'm sure that we will have a very lively discussion on the basis of this here. But before we enter into the discussion, we will first hear the thoughts of Julia here, who is, as already said, director at Breakthrough Energy, which really is in the field of trying to make sure that latest technologies are actually being used here. So she's very much very well aware of what all the constraints and all the opportunities are here. So Julia, floor is yours for a few minutes of your perspective on this, and then we open up the discussion in the panel.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Thank you, and thank you so much, Jerry. It's always an honor to come after the OECD, being an economist myself, but not practicing economics. It's always very impressive to see the amount of data and the analysis that's being done. So congratulations to you and your team. I thought I'd start with a quote from a Rolling Stones song called "Start Me Up and I'll Never Stop." Now, the Rolling Stones weren't talking about innovation policy, but they could have been. The challenge for Europe is exactly that, I would argue. Once we start the engine of science and innovation, how do we keep it running fast enough and in the right direction? So that's really what I would say this session is about, which is whether Europe and other countries' science, technology, and innovation system is pointing in the right way, and whether it's moving at the speed that the transition demands. And so my comments are really about that, and it gives the OECD report gives us an excellent map, I would say. It shows where the system is strong, what's measured, and where the gaps still lie. But what I'd like to focus here is really my remarks of how do we turn that map into motion, coming back to the Rolling Stones lyric, and how we move from analysis to acceleration. And to begin, let me tell you two journeys of two startups that I've been working with and that I've been following. And that captures, from my perspective, Europe's journey today and how we go from innovation to industrialization or not. Let me start with one story of a machine that works. It's in Milan, a team of young engineers who have posed some patents that reimagined how we could think about long-duration energy storage, so to enable more renewables to penetrate the market. Now, they're using CO2 as a working fluid, and they stitched together Horizon Europe funding, perhaps also national funding, EIC funding, then funding from Breakthrough Energy and the EIB, and now they have offtake from companies, big utilities. So in just 5 years, they went from lab to commercial scale, and that's what happens when grants, concessional, non-concessional capital, and buyer demand align, when the systems work, I would argue. Europe can scale the hardware, because a lot of what we're talking about here for the transition is deep tech, is hardware, is the new machines that are going to enable us to power the system and build what we need to do. But let me tell you another story of when the machine stalls. Another company that I'm familiar with developed high-efficiency grid conductors that are capable of passing 5 times the amount of electrons over the same amount of distance. One story here, in the case of a European country, when they wanted to sell their machines, their cables, is that they found that this country only accepted Z-shaped strands, I learned, with 100 kilometer of prior deployment qualified. So this was technically strong, innovation very much at the forefront, but administratively excluded because the market wasn't yet open and regulation wasn't updated with the pace of innovation. So both stories are real, and this is where I come to the European paradox. We're very good on we're the most climate ambition in the world region. We generate about 37% of global clean tech startups, but only, when you think about that pass-through, 14% of scale-ups. The issue isn't invention, as we know. We invent plenty, but it's the throughput, turning that innovation into industrial strengths at scale. And how I always say is, given the scale of the challenge, we need to address the challenge of scale. So this is where I see the OECD providing the same story, strong in science and early stage innovation, but limited follow-through when it comes to scaling capital and market structures that we need the most. I would call part of your conclusions is there's a scaling deficit. So what are 3 metrics, or what are 3 tests that I would suggest? I have a few slides in case we can bring them up. But I'd say we need 3 shifts or fixes that can guide us through. The first one, I would say, is the smart spending test. Coming back to where Jerry was explaining where the funding is going through, I would argue that public entities should be thinking about what is the best euro spent. First, I would say it needs to be scalable. From an environmental perspective, how do we actually reduce emissions? But of course, the affordability question is key. How do we have cost-down capable technologies or solutions? Third, in order to make sure that we accelerate and deploy at the fast pace we need, thinking about grid system compatible. And then, of course, climate change is a global issue. Energy innovation is also a global issue, so thinking about the global portability. And then supply chain sane, I would say. Now, how do we put this in practice? Well, the US did this with its Loan Program Office, and they learned that lesson by not picking winners, in a way, but having very factual data, by funding everything based on what they would call real-world data. Does the technology work? Is the feedstock secured? Is there offtake in place? Is it construction feasible? And is it risk manageable? Any project that was then able to raise the equity would get an equal proportion alone. And it's a model of how rigorous, transparent due diligence can crowd in finance rather than distort it. And this brings me to the second element as to how the OECD calls for a 3-pillar measurement blueprint. Build the data, close the evidence gap, and measure the outcomes. Here I'd call for a green premium dashboard to make that practical, a way of sort of living the element and the instrument of accountability. How are we doing for each of the sectors, what we call the grand challenges, manufacturing, buildings, power, agriculture, and transportation, understanding what is deployable now, what is next with modest policy support, what type of policy, but what still needs major public action. But more importantly, equally, is looking at the cost element here. Are we sure that these technologies will have this cost scale down so that a solution that is developed here in Europe, like low carbon cement, can be exportable to other countries, or other countries adopt that technology on the basis of that not having a major impact? The other element I would say is also to look at whether or not that technology is being adopted, that product is being bought. And this is where I think we have a very hard time in Europe, is to understand, is there demand? We have been thinking a lot about targets in terms of renewables, targets in terms of hydrogen, but whether we're looking at, are we buying, in this case hydrogen, whether or not there's demand. So, and it would measure not only the innovation activity, but the cost and speed and how close each sector is to zero cost parity. So I would argue that when you look through that lens, the priorities start to sharpen as to what you should be using that public funding for. When we examine it in a way, you could sort of think about stop, start, and scale. What do you stop funding? Where do you start funding? Because you know there is a gap, and that very much includes science and innovation in the earliest stages. And then focusing on what do you scale in order to bring down the costs. But if we want to be able to crowd in more investment, the smart spending test and the green premium dashboard tell us a lot about what projects and technologies can succeed under certain conditions. And this is where I would argue that to close this bridge of going from innovation all the way to industrialization, we also need to look at the markets. Too many stories have we heard that say, actually, my innovation and I can produce this low carbon product, but the problem I have is that the regulation isn't allowing me yet to enter the markets. We're supporting the OECD to do this and look into this from the perspective of standards, looking at cement, concrete, and sustainable aviation fuels, and whether or not those standards are fit for purpose in terms of the speed and adoption of the technology. The other question, of course, where we are very strong in Europe is this access to finance. From the perspective of there being a revenue, being demand, of course the finance will follow. But these technologies, when you're going from early stage, there's a technology risk, to a later stage, once the technology is proven, you have a commercial risk, addressing how do we build this public funding for speed, so that we have many more of these cases of how you go from A to B. I'll just end by saying, of course, the importance of the OECD reminding us that scale needs science. We need to focus much more, indeed, on what Jerry was saying around electrochemistry, materials, subsurface science, and thinking about also data and accountability. In order to be able to orient public policy, we need to be able to have this data telling us if we're going in the right direction. So putting it all together, from measuring to manufacturing, the OECD serves like a terrific map, the system, and identify the gaps. The smart spending test gives direction, what to fund and what to pause. The green premium dashboard gives us measurement, how impact evolves. The retooled finance and market gives us speed, and a strong science base and data culture keep the flywheel turning. And to circle back to where we began, borrowing once more from the Rolling Stones, start me up and don't stop me thinking about tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Julia. I think you very nicely complemented the picture that was drawn by Jerry with his indicators, by also having a look at individual cases in certain technologies. I think we definitely also need that micro evidence here, because it's at those cases of actual projects and enterprises where all the different aspects come together here and how they can or cannot be managed here. So thanks a lot for bringing in this, and I'm sure we're ready now for discussion. You might actually wonder what I'm doing here and what Bruegel would be doing here. Of course, Bruegel is also very much interested in sustainable growth here. We do our own research and advice, but particularly at the EU level, the policy making here. We also do have a tracker for clean tech that we have very recently initiated that looks in general at EU position here, but also for specific technologies here, and also for the different stages and the different countries as well, so it goes into detail. And we want to expand that also to investments in science and technology, so we'll definitely be looking at how to link that also to your data here. But the discussion, I would also really like to focus, since we're here in Brussels and at Bruegel here, is focus a bit on how the extent to which this kind of evidence, in terms of what we have and what we would need, how does that actually fit with the current EU policy of the EU in green tech here, and also the position of the EU in terms of competitiveness and of innovative power here, and to see the extent to which, with this kind of data, we could actually also help a bit the EU policy agenda, what we have and what we should have here. So can I start with the first question on this? So you do mention that the EU, although we are pretty well advanced in terms of clean tech here, so we still dominate the US, fortunately, here, but we are completely bypassed by China in terms of the patent position here. Should we be worried about this, or should we be happy in the sense that we can now free ride on what China is doing here? So the extent, how is it important to just be at the frontier by creating our own patents, or how important is it also being able to access the latest technologies for implementing here? So that would be my question for Jerry. And related to the question to Julia, so you mentioned this paradox, is we may be good in science, not good in having then the throughput of those inventions here, but are we also very good in adopting the technologies that would be elsewhere and adapting these technologies as well here? So would the paradox also hold for them? Because then, of course, it would become even more problematic in the current trends that we're seeing with China. So, Jerry.
Okay, that's a great question, and let me see if I can shed some light on some of it, and we'll turn it over to Julia on it as well. I mean, I think what's interesting to see, right, is that there are strong frameworks to encourage green and green transition in Europe, right, and that stems everything from the R&D side and the Horizon Europe programs, right, which have put, as we're calling for, more directed funding related to R&D in green technology, environmental and climate-related technologies. We can also see on the other side, right, if we look at some of the regulatory and market signals, whether it's our environmental policy stringency index, right, shows high marks for the EU in that regard. And when we look at things like the emissions trading system, the circular economy action plan, there are many pieces in place that also provide great demand for deployment of these environmental and green technologies. So to some extent, yes, the European Union is well positioned, if you will, at both ends of the spectrum, and I think the bridge image, right, is a great graphic to highlight. It is about trying to transition across these two. I think what some of our data show, right, is that if you look at what's happening outside Europe and really outside the OECD countries, the capacity is becoming not just about capacity and strength in the manufacturing of green technologies in non-OECD countries, including China most notably, right? But that's moving, if you will, upstream, being competitive in producing new patents that demonstrate that we're moving the technological frontier ahead. And as you see in the chart, also great productivity on the research side as well. So they've moved to the research frontier as well, and all the indicators we have that try to sort out high-quality patents and high-quality publications demonstrate that. So there is this new competition. So yes, the EU, I think, faces a choice now because, and recognizing that I guess there are two opportunities. One is the green transition itself in terms of meeting sustainable development goals and so forth, which, yes, you could acquire by, quote, purchasing off the market these technologies. But there's also the industrial side. There's great opportunity, right, in participating in the green technology movement, whether it's for energy, it's mobility, and others. And I think that's where having the capability to move from science and technology into innovation and market deployment becomes so incredibly important. And we need to try to move both of those ambitions, becoming more green at the same time as the European Union positions itself to be more competitive in these sectors. And that's why we need a fuller set of policy instruments in place. And I think, as we've been saying, we need the measurement dashboard, right, that allows you to see how well the European Union, other OECD countries, and beyond are performing on all of those measures.
Policy mix instruments that we are using here, because like you rightly point out, we do already have a very well established policy mix of funding, of a lot of standards, regulations here. Still we are facing this gap here. So is it that we don't have the right mix, or is it that we're still missing bits and pieces of the full policy agenda to make sure that we get over this paradox here? So Julia, what's your perspective on this?
I would very much agree with what Jerry is saying. Perhaps to add some case examples. You asked the question around adoption, right? I mean, we have invested in over 150, 130 startups, and we've been working with coalitions like Clean Tech for Europe, Clean Tech for Benelux, that also have in their membership companies that have raised at least 50 million, so scale-up companies. And what we see every day is stories where, okay, I have a great technology, I'm ready to see the market opportunity because it's geothermal or because it's green steel or because it's, and the case can go on, but here's my challenge. And my challenge might be grid connectivity. My challenge might be there's still a lack of capital in the growth stage. There is a challenge here with regards to actually defining a product that is new, like geothermal or cases like natural hydrogen, but actually it's not yet defined, or I need to wait for the delegated act to be defined. So I'm pushing it a little bit to the extreme, but the challenge that we see is actually the rate of adoption is often hampered because there's still, I would argue, a big focus on targets, but without thinking what is going to enable that target to materialize. So in a way, you have a vision, you know where you want to go. With Jerry and I, we're talking on the way here, thinking about, you know where you're driving your plane, the destination, but you still don't have the full cockpit of measures to be able to enable you to do that. We did earlier this year this clean tech reality check where we looked at hydrogen, we looked at electrification, we looked at manufacturing, and we posed the question, okay, there's a target of 10 million tons of domestic production of green hydrogen. Who's buying it? Is there actually adoption? That to measure whether or not the projects that were announced were actually shovels in the ground. Well, the reality that we saw is that the ones that were getting pumped were actually the refinery sector because there's a carbon price, because there's a mandate, but the ones that were ready for takeoff but still not taking off is the aviation, because the penalties haven't yet kicked in if you don't use hydrogen for sustainable aviation fuels. And the one that we thought a bit to the extreme was sinking before you sail was actually the one in the maritime sector, because there's no mandate, or at least this was before the IMO came on. So I do think it's really important to look at it in a way from a regulatory or policy maturity map. Where are you in the stage of being able to actually have bankers say, I'm going to lend to your project, or off-takers ready to sign the contract? And that to me is thinking, it's not a question of diagnosis. Again, there's been fantastic people who've been on this stage as well here, making the diagnostic of what doesn't work. I would argue that you need speed, scale, and honestly a bit of that dashboard roadmap to see, okay, what are the indicators that aren't working, that are really should be in red, that we should try to address. Again, I'm very much in favor of supporting R&D, including through public budgets, but if you're doing that but not enabling the plane to fly the last few kilometers, then you're in a way stuck towards being flying in the air and not closing that bridge, or landing for that matter.
Yeah, I really like that that picture that you drew with the airplane. I'm also wondering, to which extent are we in Europe sometimes also trying to drive too much in a certain direction without actually knowing the market not yet and the technology is not yet being ready to here. Particularly because, as you also mentioned, Jerry, a lot of these green technologies, they draw on multiple disciplines, multiple technologies, crossing boundaries, national, across companies as well. So to which extent are we sometimes also driving too much particular technologies too early into certain directions here? And then what matters is not just knowing the instruments, but also the mix of instruments between this kind of bottom-up framework type of condition interventions versus much more directed. This is a big issue for environmental because we need to direct, but how much do we find the right balance between directedness versus making sure we create framework conditions and leverage the private sector also maximally. So do we have already enough evidence on this, not just total budgets, but also how the directedness, the nature of the budget would matter, or is this something that we don't need to know?
Yeah, no, I think we do have, and we've got good evidence on it in one of the pages in the report sitting in front of you. I mean, looking at the difference between more directive funding and we compare it with is directive funding versus neutral instruments like tax incentives. And in fact, what we have seen, and this includes in the European Union as well as across the OECD, has been an increase in the use of more neutral instruments like tax incentives, right? They account for a greater share of overall R&D spending today than they did in the past. We have more countries that have these measures in place. That can be very effective in ensuring, if you will, that all companies that engage in R&D have some form of financial support for it, an additional incentive to do it. But it doesn't direct it into particular areas. And that's where we see tax incentives and direct funding not operating in competition with one another, right? But they're really complementary measures. As I say, we've seen the balance shifting toward the more neutral. Maybe if what we have are more goal-oriented ambitions in mind, whether it's around sustainability and environment, it's improved mobility, it's improved aging and health, we need to be more directive in how those allocations are made. But you raise another point too, and as you could see on one of the slides I had, I mean, the number of different disciplines that have to contribute to solving our solutions, right? We can try to be more directive and goal-oriented, and we refer to mission-oriented innovation policies. Those often require mobilizing research in many different disciplines, which can be difficult to do in a lot of our existing institutional structures, right? We have our chemists who work on our chemistry departments and our material scientists, which to me seems like a branch of chemistry, right? But they often work separately. How do we create the kinds of centers, if you will, and the other kind of collaborative research mechanisms that will bring those different disciplines together to work toward common ambitions? And I think that's where there's still lots of opportunity for reform and restructuring the way we think about the science system to enhance its ability to contribute to the innovation process. And then, of course, there's everything downstream that needs to be done to help mobilize the ability of companies to adopt new technologies and thinking through the broad range of other kinds of supports that might be needed. So you mentioned maritime shipping and so forth. If we want to meet the ambition of transitioning shipbuilding to something greener, we need to think about how do you actually get the new fuels to port, right? As well as how do you build the ships that are capable of running on ammonia or hydrogen or whatever the fuel of the future is going to be?
Yep. So Julia, what's your experience in terms of how the ventures that you are dealing with, do they perceive the policy interventions too much as picking versus allowing enough freedom, setting the boundaries, but still allowing enough freedom to operate?
That's a great question. I would say that there are many different sides of that story. Some of them will tend to indeed say there's too much picking. And I'll give a neutral example without sort of naming the case, but you have, of course, governments that want to decarbonize existing facilities, which is very important. So they want to support that type of activity. At the same time, you will have an opportunity. I'll give the example, which is of cement, which is one that I discussed last week at the OECD. You have the opportunity to either you put carbon capture and storage, and that decarbonizes what is the clinker making process, and then you have the same product. Or you have novel cement and concrete where you actually avoid the entire cement process. Well, that in public budgets, you will either have those public budgets that actually support carbon capture and storage and decarbonization of existing sites. But in the case of those that want to develop novel cements and are actually reducing the carbon footprint of the cement sector, they will not be eligible on the basis of this because it's not decarbonizing the existing sites. Yes, it is, whilst it still is decarbonizing the entire sector. So I do think that that's a story where, yes, indeed, there you're probably picking winners. On the other hand, there are other options that I see where you're more neutral in the sense that you are actually supporting a certain type of material technology that can then be used cross-sector, and that definitely is laudable, and including what was just, I think, announced as the Nobel Prize being an advance in that area that can be multiple uses. But I do think that there's often this idea of squares and boxes and not necessarily enough understanding of what is happening at the tech frontier, what is happening in innovation, and the ability of governments, including the European Union, to understand where are we in the tech frontier and looking at whether or not there are barriers along the way. Typical example, one that I've come to learn, is this idea of having hydrogen that comes out of the ground, which has been proven in certain geographies. People are right now in Europe talking about green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and some geographies have regulated so that if you go underground, it's actually considered as a hydrocarbon, so it's prevented. But what happens if the tech frontier is actually showing you that there's a resource that's underground? So what do? How does regulation help create those markets? So what I think is really important is definitely to use even more of these indicators and then understand whether or not there's an ability to access the market. Then there will be the financing question. But to me, there's really a need to understand what's the tech frontier, what are the solutions that are being developed, and then what are the challenges. So more dialogue is also what I'd call out from coming out of these indicators.
Right, yeah. And do you think that then we need also, on a much more disaggregated level, these kind of indicators to really identify, not in general, but also for very specific technologies and stages of these technologies, early stage versus more established stages here? And is that the challenge that you faced when you were collecting the latest version of statistics? How detailed you could actually go in that respect? Like, for instance, R&D, public R&D, how much does it go to the different kind of clean tech technologies?
Yeah, so I think in the report, this is one of the things that we had to do that was, I think, quite innovative too, was using novel methodologies for being able to look at how to at what is an environmental technologies or green-related technologies. Those can be hard to get from official government statistics, but we have been working, among others, in some projects, the FundRef project, right, among others, where we're actually beginning to look at the award and the text about projects that are being awarded. I think we now have data for about 19 different OECD countries. So we can use that, apply a little bit of machine learning to it as well, so that we can do some classifications. So what you see in the report, and I think this is novel for this report as well, are some of the first indications of R&D broken out into these, some related to Sustainable Development Goals in general, some of those including the specific focus on energy and environment. So it's interesting now because we're also at a moment, this is like part of the twin transitions, right? The green and digital. We can use some of our digital technologies, we can use machine learning, we can use AI when we have access to reliable underlying data like award textual information and others to begin to see and analyze these R&D data in new ways.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
And I would just come back to the green premium dashboard, where you first look at what is the maturity, and then making smart choices that are hard choices, right? Which technology area do you support or don't you support? Coming back to my cement facility, it's not an easy choice, right? That needs to be a political choice. Are you going to be? How do you support, and in what manner do you support? But I do think that there's some obvious choices that need to be made and encouraged. I'll give you another case around long duration energy storage, which is enabling then more renewables to come online. There are not many countries that are encouraging that type of long duration energy storage as they're thinking about their power markets. There was this example in Italy, which is one actually of the countries that have decided to reward this capability of storing electricity for a longer period than otherwise. The challenge, though, was that when they started to define what would be eligible as a technology, they used only technologies that were very mature, so lithium ion and pumped hydro. They didn't go out into the market and ask, what other technologies do you have, like using bricks or others? So they selected, in this case, in the end, they ended up selecting that 10% of the technologies or companies that could be part of this auction would be innovative technologies. But then they only chose for the rest of the 90% lithium ion and others. So it poses the question of, there's an essential need to store electricity. There is an essential opportunity in the case here of using this mechanism to deploy what is still in innovation and demonstration phase. Again, but how fast do you make that happen? And that also required lot of push from the innovation community, from the startups, from the scale-ups to explain, hey, here are some technologies in which we believe, and then the assessment needs to be made by the ones that have the expertise. It's not.
Right. Yeah.
But this is where I see that there's, again, this bridge is really a metaphor for showing how there is that discrepancy between what are the scientists, what are the skills that we want to develop, and then how that is applied so it materializes into a competitive advantage, or it materializes into an energy source that is domestic.
Yeah, I definitely also like your perspective on taking into account the life cycle of the technologies in order to identify what kind of policies do we need, and really making a distinction between more mature technologies versus the really very early stage where we have still not yet an idea of the market. That requires completely different kind of interventions, both in terms of size and in terms of mission-orientedness, definitely. I wanted to also ask, particularly with the breakthrough ventures perspective here. So we talked a lot about public policy, and it's clear we need that here to stir the machine. But to which extent can the private sector also compensate for any choices that the public sector may not have made? Does it compensate for that, or does it on the contrary, actually enforces any choices here? So to which extent can, like for instance, if technologies we've missed with the public support, is it something that then the private sector would take up, or would they just wait till there is a choice made by the public sector and then exacerbate that?
Well, I think perhaps maybe if I can start on the breakthrough energy side, from we have three programs: discovery, development, and deployment. And I can say that I'm probably one of the only non-PhD in many multiple chemical, mechanical, and engineering profiles, right? I'm an economist. But the point that I'm trying to make is that a lot of we start with the science and the technology, and we have another metric, which is impact. The technology family needs to reduce emissions by 1% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there are multiple companies in which we've invested that have either been created by breakthrough and seeded, which you call venture development, venture building, or we found the best scientists. And that's informed by our discovery program, where we do the workshops, and also by our fellows program, where we support them. And then our investment team is also very much in the science. Why do I say that? Is because I think where we start is mostly looking at what is the challenge, what are we trying to solve for. We're not looking at what is the policy environment in which we're going to go. Then, of course, over the maturity of a company, then we do see Europe much more as a deployment, and we have co-invested with the European Commission and the EIB. We have European startups, but it doesn't start with this question of policy. It starts with the question of what are we trying to solve for, and then how do we address them, those challenges. And again, I think the role here that we play is more one of trying to inform what is the tech edge, what are we seeing, what are the solutions that we believe in, and then we work around, okay, how do we need to innovate in the way that we collaborate, in the way that we finance, and in the way that the public policymakers should think about those solutions.
Okay, so you like to be complementary, but sometimes you need to substitute for. I think it's high time we also, you've been very patient, to open up the floor for the general discussion. We do have also some questions on Slido, but I would like to give a preference to the people here in the room here. So let's start with questions from the room here. So if you raise your hand, then the mic will arrive.
My name is Richard Tufts, Friends of Smart Specialization. I was at the recent Research and Innovation Days here, and there was two expressions. One, we win it, Europe wins in the lab, but loses on Wall Street. So this idea that we're good at innovation, but we can't scale up. And talking of your scaling up, you used to need lead markets and investment standardization. Could public procurement play a stronger role in driving innovation?
Yeah, that's a very clear question. I'm collecting a few questions from the floor to be more time efficient. Yep.
I'm Gertrude Kingelman from Centexwell. Okay, nobody knows it, I'm sure. It's a research center for textiles and plastics, so I'm one of those scientists out there.
Yep.
I was just wondering, because regarding the impact of direct support versus tax incentive to encourage those green innovations, I'm very surprised to see that direct support has more impact, because in reality, many governments, at least what I notice, they try to have more tax incentives. So why then are they going to the direction that doesn't really work?
Yeah. Very good. There was also a question on Slido on this direct support versus tax incentives here. Yeah. Any other questions? So maybe then I can also tie it to so recommendations you might also have for the European Competitive Fund and the Horizon Europe here, because we've already talked a lot about this, so maybe we could also turn this into a bit, if you would have great ideas, this is the right time. Yeah.
It's always the right time for great ideas, don't you think?
Yes,
so let me try to address a couple of the questions. I mean, first, I think the one about the R&D versus R&D tax incentives versus direct funding. So again, I think our analytical work shows that whether you measure it in terms of patent generation, whether you measure it in terms of other like publications and outputs in a particular area, that you can see more of a relationship between direct funding in those areas and tax incentives. That's partly because, I mean, tax incentives are neutral, right? They can be used by firms in any sector. I think you mentioned you do textiles and plastics, right? So they may be very helpful in motivating R&D in those areas. Whether or not that R&D is then translated toward moving toward greener alternatives is sort of an open question, right? So it can be used in many different ways. So what we have seen, though, is that countries, partly because of maybe the administrative simplicity, although there are other challenges, right, in R&D tax incentives, and an interest in making sure that there is broad-based kind of coverage and availability of incentives to businesses to invest more in R&D, they're an effective complementary tool. And I think that's also, you know, one of the key messages is that, again, I'll repeat what I said before. They're not really in competition with each other. You need to have the right balance of them to achieve your ultimate goals, and that's where having good metrics about how quickly are we making it toward a more sustainable, greener, cleaner economy are really important to have. Let me come back to the first question, right, which I think was about using smart, using procurement. So I would say absolutely, right. We've done quite a bit of work at the OECD looking at sort of, you know, demand side stimuli for innovation, and, you know, government markets and government purchases can be very important tools for doing that if you're trying to then purchase products that are beyond the cutting edge, right? And I would bundle them with other sets of incentives. And as I mentioned, Europe does pretty well in these for encouraging businesses to move and adopt new technology. I would also say this is maybe what we're beginning to see somewhat in the broader discussions now that are recurring around industrial policies, right? So we talk about science and tech and innovation policies. You know, the discussion on industrial policy, to me, has been much stimulated recently by the desire to move industry as a whole, whether it's in concrete and cement industries. We work with more closely in my unit on steel and shipbuilding and others. How do you help them accelerate, sometimes to afford, to purchase technologies that are cleaner? And government procurement is certainly one of the mechanisms that can be used. Other kinds of regulatory incentives that encourage or provide incentives or support for those are certainly part of the policy mix there.
Yep. So really, again, illustrates this difficulty of, on the one hand, being sufficiently technology and market specific, but on the other hand, also being sufficiently able to cross the boundaries still of many technologies and markets that we need to. Julia,
so I'll be quick. I wanted to come back to the point around public procurement and come back to the US agency called ARPA-E, which is around energy and breakthroughs. And they have this motto, which says, if it works, will it matter? And the point here is that it's not because the technology works that it will be adopted. So the point around public procurement, absolutely, where the government has a role in buying. Jerry, I fully agree. The OECD has done some excellent work, has guidebooks on public procurement, and looking at both commodities but also other types of markets. But for sure, that's a lever. As to the question on European recommendations for the Competitiveness Fund and Horizon Europe, I'd say two simple things. And we can go on offline on this, but one of them is put yourself in the shoes of startups and scale-ups in Europe and asking these two questions that I had at the beginning, or these two stories that I had. There's a way where there's a path, and that Competitiveness and Horizon Europe Fund can go quite smoothly, right? And there you have public support along the way. And there's a path where that is actually really complicated. And so I think just putting ourselves in the shoes of who's actually going to be applying to those funds. And the second is, I do think that there's some hard choices to make, again, in terms of, are we supporting the right technology, the right project areas, and asking that question of cost and scale entitlement is critical. So having more metrics in a dashboard, maybe using the green premium as a yardstick and others, I think will be very useful for how we actually implement it.
Yeah, but also more indicators to measure the effectiveness of not just purely the inputs, but also the effectiveness, and that's why indicators on impact will be very important. Yeah, unless there are any other more questions here, unfortunately, it's already 2 o'clock. We would have to end. I would also definitely like to emphasize that the last question I was raised on human talent and the war for talent, I think, is super important. Access to skills is something that lots of ventures actually identify as the major one here. It's also the talent that will be able to really cross all these different competences, technologies, markets that you actually need here. So this skill agenda is also super important, and we always only discuss it at the end, which is unfortunate, but maybe we'll come back with a new event on that, really dedicated on this. So let me here thank, first of all, both Jerry and Julia here. It was an incredibly complementary presentations and views that we had here, and this is very informative also for guiding the EU policy agenda here, which at Bruegel we will definitely be very closely following, but also trying to be a motor of this and making sure that the right kind of evidence is used for policy actions here. So we will definitely keep in touch here and hope that you will also be keeping in touch with coming to our events here. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.